This is a new tape which we've put together as a result of some of the work that I've been doing on my farm during the summer of 1976. We're including a number of different topics in this tape. First, you're going to see some cuts on a new variety of greenhouse which I've been developing, which I think possibly could be useful to you. And then I'll show you my windmill, which I use to pump water for watering my greenhouse. And then we're going to talk about larger scale market style gardening. Okay, what we're going to show you now is two dome greenhouses which I built this summer. What I've been looking for is some way to cover ground in a cheap and simple and economical fashion, to design a greenhouse that any average handyman could slap together in his spare time without costing too much money. So here you have two examples of a geodesic dome greenhouse. The plastic covered greenhouse, which you see there, was my first attempt, and I completed that about the first week in July, and it has a reasonable growth of plants inside. What it is a frame made of 1/2-inch electrical conduit, which is bolted together, and then over the top of that is a piece of fishnet, which is hauled down as tight as I can get it, and then a piece of plastic is thrown over the top of that, and then another piece of fishnet is put over the top of the plastic. The outside piece of fishnet is held down by rocks which are hooked all around the base of the net. So these rocks keep the fishnet nice and tight at all times. Now, even though there's a fair wind blowing today, you can see that the plastic holds nice and still and doesn't rattle and bang around. This makes for a very pleasant greenhouse to work in. Now over here, I have a smaller greenhouse. This is 15 feet in diameter. I designed this second as a prototype of a typical greenhouse which I'd suggest you put in your backyard. This is 15 feet in diameter, and there's probably about 175 square feet of growing space in there. And for an average family, you can grow all the tomatoes and corn and peppers and cucumbers you can ever need in a greenhouse like this. I think this is somewhat of an improvement over this greenhouse for a number of reasons. For one thing, I've developed a better way to hold the inside netting down really tight. You'll see that it is held down by large elastic bands made from circles of inner tubing. Secondly, there are only 3 different lengths of pipe involved. I've colored them for your ease of recognition. There are the black pipes, there are these red pipes here, and there are these yellow pipes here. These different colors represent 3 different lengths. So what you have to find out is what size of greenhouse you're going to build, and if you write to me, I can tell you how long to cut your pieces of pipe, and then it's a simple matter of following a simple pattern, and you bolt the whole thing together. This dome over here, this first dome that I built, had 17 different lengths. So it was quite a complex dome. It was more complex because, as you see, it isn't spherical in shape, but it's squashed. it's squashed in shape. Now another error in the first dome which I built was that I didn't have adequate ventilation. And I've tried to do something about that in this dome by putting well-designed windows which can be opened and closed from the inside, and these are covered by screening on the outside. I've got 2 windows in the bottom. I've got a third window in the door of the greenhouse, and then I've got a window up at the top of the greenhouse which can be opened. With a greenhouse like this, you should never have to have any fans. You open up the bottom vents, and as the greenhouse heats up, the hot air rises and flows out through the vent in the top of the greenhouse. And it should be a self-ventilating greenhouse and should regulate its temperature very well. The door here was somewhat complex. I made a frame of aluminum and pop riveted it to the pipe, and then took a piece of plywood, laid it against that aluminum frame. You could just as easily make a frame out of plywood, and then cut the door out of the frame and hinge the door onto the frame. This is the largest of the 3 experimental dome greenhouses that I've built this summer. This is about 30 feet in diameter, and as you can see, it's approximately 9 to 10 feet high in the center. There are a number of things that are sort of interesting to point out in this greenhouse. I built this on rough sod. I didn't want to go to the work of digging up the sod, and there was very little soil here in the first place. So all I did, I had a bunch of fill and sod and manure, and I brought it in and I put about a foot-deep layer all over the top of the sod which was originally here. This way I didn't have to dig up the original sod. The original sod will rot down, and by next year it will be easy to dig up. Another thing is that it's much simpler to build a dome greenhouse starting at the top and working down, and then building the foundation the last thing of all. This is the complete reverse of how you usually build things. But because the foundation is rather complicated, it's much easier to do it that way. It's very easy to lift up part of the dome. It's quite light, but at the same time, it's quite strong. Those few cuts will show you a little bit about dome greenhouses. Obviously, it's not going to be enough for you to go out and build your own. So if you are interested in trying to build a greenhouse like that, why don't you drop me a line, and I'll send you a description, a detailed written description of how to build a greenhouse of that type. Give you a little bit of theory and a few details. Now we're in the process of preparing a videotape which will go in great detail from the very beginning all through the whole construction process of building the smaller 15-foot dome. Now you may want to know, well, how much does a dome like that cost? Well, the 15-foot dome cost me about $150. But if you're fairly good at scrounging bits and pieces, especially the fishnet, you can probably build it for quite a bit less than that. All the materials to build such a greenhouse should be easily available to you. 4-mil plastic, fishnet, half-inch electrical conduit, and plywood. And that's all you really need. And there are no extra specialized tools to build a greenhouse like that. Now we're going to take a look at my windmill, which is used to pump water to irrigate the greenhouses. This is a windmill which is designed to pump water. It's called a Savonius rotor. And what it is 2 oil drums which have been cut in half longitudinally, welded together with an axle run down through the middle. Then there are 2 rings or circles of plywood on the top and the bottom, and the axle rotates in 2 bearings at the top and bottom of the frame. The rotary movement is then carried from the windmill via this elongated drive shaft to the differential, where the movement is changed from a vertical to a horizontal movement. This differential gears the speed down 4 times, but this belt going to the pump gears it up 6 times, so there's a fairly respectable speed of pumping. The pump pumps water from the well, which is here, which transfers water through to the hose here. Now this hose eventually will go into the top of a large 1,500-gallon reservoir, which I'll use next year to irrigate my gardens and greenhouses. I'd like to point out that everything here, from the oil drums and the axle, pump, everything is salvage material. That's part of the game. Even the posts for the framing is salvage material. Now, under certain circumstances, that is when the well goes dry or when you have extremely high winds, you may want to stop the windmill, and for that purpose I've designed an extremely intricate and complex braking system. This is how it works. Take a bucket with several bricks in it, and you hang it down there, and it goes up to a 2x4, which is hinged on the frame. And when you put the bucket down, the 2x4 rubs against the bottom of the plywood and stops the windmill. Another thing we were experimenting with this summer was to try to extend our organic gardening techniques and concepts from intensive growing to extensive growing. Now here I have a field here which I'm going to work with in the next couple of years to see if I can mechanize a little bit. I have a small garden tractor, and I'm going to see if I can grow on a larger scale using organic techniques. This is the main criticism which the critics of organic gardening throw at you, is that it's all very well to do it in gardening, but you can't do it in farming. Well, I don't know if I can or not, but I'm starting out to try to, and I'll explain in brief some of the techniques that I'm going to try to use. I've divided my field into 2 sections. One section you can see is in row crops now, and one section is in buckwheat and oats. Now the row crops don't look very big now because I didn't get this started or planted till about the 16th of July. This buckwheat and oats was also planted about the 16th of July. So it's really come along fairly well for the short period of time that it's had to grow in. Now what I'm going to do is to take 1/2 in 1 year growing in row crops, 1/2 growing in green manure. Next spring, I'll plow all this material into the ground. I'm not going to take it off and use it for feed. I'll leave it right in place. I'll plow it all into the ground, and this will provide the manure right in place. I won't have to bring it in. You know, if you're going to grow on a large scale, the major problem is where do I get sufficient manure to provide the fertility I need for organic growing. Well, here it is growing right in place. So I'll grind that into the ground. That'll provide the manure directly in place to provide the fertility that I need to grow. Early in the spring, I'll sow this whole area here, which now has row crops. I'll sow this in turnip tops, rapeseed. I'll let that grow up till maybe the 1st of July, first week in July. We'll harvest any that we want by hand, and then we'll dig the rest into the ground. Then I'll put a planting of buckwheat or oats in about the middle of July and let that grow up. So I'll have 2 crops of green manure growing in this area while I'm getting my crop of row crops off here. The following year, I'll go back to green manuring this area and growing row crops in this area. Now this is getting on to early or mid-October, and I'm turning the green manure crop under, plowing it under, and I'll leave it in this rough condition over the winter. What happens to these clods during the winter is the rain will fall on them, it'll get cold, they'll freeze, and all these ice crystals inside the soil will rupture the soil apart, and it will granularize the soil. It will give the soil a very nice consistency. And by next May or early June, when I'm ready to plant this area, I'm going to plant this area in vegetables. The soil will be a nice, fluffy, light consistency, and very good for putting down a garden. Now the history of this particular field is up until about 3 years ago, this was an extremely old pasture, rather very unproductive, very tightly bound sod producing a small quantity of very fine, tough hay and a lot of weeds. I plowed this down. I wouldn't be able to plow it down with that small tractor there. That tractor simply isn't strong enough to turn old sod. I had to get a neighboring farmer who had a large, full-sized farm tractor in to turn down this area of old sod. I was turned down 2 falls ago. Last spring, the spring before this present year, I went over it with a harrow and beat it down as well as I could. It was still very tough, the old sods were still very tough, but I flattened it as well as I could, and I planted oats and hayseed. That grew through last summer. This summer, I plowed this area down again in about July. The hayseed hadn't taken very well. There was some growth of hay left on it, so I plowed it down in July. It was much easier to plow. I could plow it with my small tractor. Then I planted oats and buckwheat. This grew up to make a good growth of plant material, which I'm now plowing back into the ground to enrich the ground with organic matter. And if you look close to the soil, you'll see that the soil isn't just mud, it has structure. There are fibers going all through it. There are little bits of plant, dead plant through the soil. The soil is alive, it has structure, and here and there you find a nice big earthworm. Now the more I do this, the more lime I put on this soil, and the more times I go through this procedure of digging in plant material, the more worms I'll have in my soil. And worms are not only extremely good for the soil, but they're the best and quickest way to see. It's a diagnostic tool. You can see if your soil is in good health if there are a lot of worms. You turn over your soil, and it's very acid and very old sod, there probably will be very few worms. Get lime into it, turn your soil again and again and again, and the worms will grow and multiply. And that's a sign that your soil is coming back to health, is becoming alive.
Okay.
If this is an area of new sod, which my farmer friend plowed for me about 3 weeks ago. You can see that the sod is extremely tough, extremely hard, very difficult to work. You wouldn't be able to make this into nice garden soil for at least a year. This will have to sit at least a year before it's going to be good garden soil. Now it's mid-October now. We're going into the winter. This will sit through the winter. And next spring, I'll run a harrow or rototiller over the surface of this ground and flatten it out sufficiently so that I can plant oats and hayseed, timothy, and clover in it. Here we have an area which is planted in late July in oats and timothy and clover. It would have been that high if I had been able to get it in early June. This should have been planted in early June, and then we would have had a really good stand of oats and hay by this time. But this is the way that you get old pasture back into production. Get it turned over, plant it to oats and hay, leave it for a year. The following year, that old sod will be sufficiently rotted down that you can start getting lighter equipment into it and turning it over. There's a lot of good organic matter there in that old sod, but it needs a year to rot down and turn the soil into nice, mellow, soft material. It needs 2 winters to get workable. So that will give you a few ideas of what we were doing last summer. And in the coming season, we're going to be continuing with the same line of research and hopefully by next fall we'll have more information on all of those subjects. Please remember, if you have particular interests or questions on any subject, please write me, John Evans, care of Biology Department, Memorial University. I'll be very glad to try and answer your questions. Thank you.